Tom Holland is arguably the most controversial Spider-Man actor. No other actor has inspired more hot takes, hatred, and praise than him. His films are simultaneously hyped and hated all at the same time. You either love them, or you think they're a complete disaster that ruined the character. No real middle ground there, I think. At the same time, no matter how much the internet hates the MCU or hates Tom Holland's films, every time you go and see his movie, general audiences across the world cannot get enough of Spider-Man. Across 6 movies, and soon to be 7 as of this recording, we have come to know Tom's Spider-Man as seen by 2 different creative approaches. The Russo brothers and John Watts. Both have interpreted Spidey in different ways that ultimately best simulate that feeling you get when you pick up a comic, you read an issue, and then read another issue. Reading Amazing Spider-Man, where Peter is this insecure loser kid who keeps screwing up, who the city hates and fears. And then you pick up an issue of the Avengers, where Peter Parker is just this class clown who's confident and snarky and silly and busting Wolverine's chops and maybe has a crush on She-Hulk. I love when comics do that and completely show a different version of the character from one comic to the next. The MCU has dominated discussion regarding Peter for years now, so I feel like it's a good time as any to really analyze how this approach for Tom is an adaptation of the comic, but also something wholly new. We're going to look at common criticisms of the character, as best encapsulated by High Top Review's extensive response videos to the MCU character. We're going to look at some of his critiques there and respond, as well as ultimately look at how Brand New Day handles Tom Holland. Does the new film address the core critiques fans have had for the character since the beginning? Let's find out. One controversial decision with Tom Holland's Spider-Man is that we never see his origin. We know he was bitten by a radioactive spider, that Uncle Ben died, and that prior to Captain America Civil War, he had been Spider-Man for about 6 or so months, helping out with street-level crime and random miscellanea, while demonstrating his incredible power saving civilians. But we don't know about Ben. We don't really know much of what happened during this time. Not really. The most we get from Peter is this variation of the Great Power speech that implies there was something that happened that Peter didn't deal with properly when he was younger. Peter blames himself for something in the past, and that motivates him to do the right thing moving forward. He didn't use his powers potentially, but we don't see it. Most people assume this refers to Uncle Ben's death, his fate. In the original comics, Spider-Man becomes a minor celebrity as a wrestler. He uses his power for profit. He is indifferent to the studio getting robbed, choosing not to interfere. The robber who robs the studio eventually breaks into Peter's home and, in a struggle, shoots Uncle Ben dead. This is mostly adapted pretty faithfully in the original Raimi films, with 2 added elements. The first element is who the robber stole from. That guy just screwed Peter out of money. A lot of money. And he needed that money. Peter kind of lets the guy go out of spite. But the other thing is that the robber who robs the boss isn't the guy who directly killed Uncle Ben. We learn in Spider-Man 3 it was actually Flint Marko who accidentally discharged his weapon into Uncle Ben after the first guy bumped his arm or something on a hasty retreat. Now, this incident is not tinged by indifference, but active malice. You see, Peter lets the guy go out of petty, selfish intent, not negligence, not like in the comics. The series then deals with Peter's pettiness and anger all the way to the 3rd film, creating a driving through line that kind of runs parallel to Harry Osborn's anger towards Spider-Man, the resentment, the grudge that builds into a destructive force. Both Peter and Flint accidentally kill a parental figure, in essence, and both ultimately are forgiven by the target of their revenge. Peter forgives Flint, and Harry forgives Peter for killing Norman Osborn. Also, the robber gets dropped out a fucking window, so that's a whole fucking thing. Meanwhile, the Amazing Spider-Man does something a little different. Uncle Ben dies in a random act of violence. Peter, again, is indifferent to a minor crime happening in front of him in the city. Someone gets robbed. Uncle Ben tries to stop the thief and gets shot needlessly. It's all needless. He doesn't need to actually struggle with this guy in the street. He just does it out of instinct. And it feels avoidable, sudden, and it never gets resolved. And I kind of like that. This illustrates a different reality for Spider-Man. Sometimes shit just happens, and there's no master plan. There's no greater theme. Sometimes shit happens, and you gotta deal with it. This is in complete odds with everything else in the duology, when everything that happens is part of a gigantic master plan that started from the beginning with Peter's parents and Norman Osborn. It's bizarre. I don't like that. But I like this sense of randomness that doesn't get resolved, and Peter just kind of drops it after a while. Despite focusing on it, he goes nowhere. It's a tragedy. but at least it's interesting. So where does Uncle Ben's fate fall in the MCU? Well, it doesn't factor into anything. A recent interview with the Russo brothers and CBR illustrated that the Russos, when introducing Spider-Man, believe that whatever killed Uncle Ben wasn't Peter's fault, and he doesn't really blame himself at all for this.
What I related to was this idea of a kid with incredible responsibility, right? And I think that you could manifest that responsibility through accidental death, right? And feeling the pressure and the sense of loss in your life in a way that would keep the spirit of what we wanted. But what Tom Holland is as an actor, if he blamed himself for his Uncle Ben's death, I think that becomes a very different character. So in our minds, no, he wasn't responsible for Uncle Ben's death. That would have been a different interpretation, a more intense interpretation of the character.
And this results in a Peter who has to learn the intense lessons of responsibility over the course of 6 films. It allows Peter's arc to rely less on the trauma of one incident and instead build across many smaller incidences over time. This, I feel, defines the MCU Peter as someone who is still developing rather than emerging fully formed, rather than dealing with some major issue. Many comic fans, I think, see Uncle Ben as a figure of incredible importance, and they have every right to. He's a major character. But he's not the only tragedy Peter experiences. Peter builds across multiple stories, across several decades. The Raimi films centered Uncle Ben almost as this foundational character who everything tied back to. In every film, Uncle Ben is there in some way. His loss impacts Aunt May's struggles. But in the MCU, life moves on past Uncle Ben. Aunt May has charitable work with Feast going. She isn't the source of wisdom she is in the Raimi trilogy, or the stressed, overworked maternal figure that she is in the Web duology. She has a mostly unexplored life outside Peter, and while it does suck that we don't get to know her more, and I will bring this up later on, before she's killed by Green Goblin, in a death that illustrates the consequences of Peter's good deeds, there is a point to Aunt May's death. Aunt May dies because Peter tries curing his villains. He does a good deed to try to help someone out, and he's rewarded for that with negative consequences. This is one of the key things of Spider-Man's life, that his good deeds do not go unpunished. He learns that his actions in the individual realities these villains come from will lead to their deaths, and so does the right thing to try to help them, and it still leads to Aunt May dying. You can do everything right, and it still goes wrong for you. I feel like these creative choices help establish the starting point for each of these characters. We have a character who is defined by pain and pettiness, a character defined by unresolved, unfulfilling scenarios, and a character who's defined by still growing, by multiple smaller tragedies that culminate in a large one that is directly his fault for doing the right thing. How does this shape Peter? What does this mean for the MCU Peter in this regard? Let's start with Civil War. Spider-Man's role in Civil War is small but instrumental as an introduction. He doesn't play a major role in Civil War like he does in the comics as a centerpiece of the Superhuman Registration Act. Rather, he's mentored by Tony Stark, the start of his Iron Boy Jr. arc, as some derisively say. I think the closest equivalent to this moment in the comics is in Amazing Spider-Man #1, the first issue of the Stan Lee Steve Ditko run of Spider-Man. Now, at this point, the only villain Peter has really fought is Uncle Ben's killer, meaning he has minimal experience with other heroes. Like in Civil War, he's untested, green behind the ears, especially with superpowered adversaries, but he needs more money. You see, even though he did wrestling on TV, he can't exactly give them a name to write the check to. They don't write a check out to Spider-Man. He doesn't have a bank account to Spider-Man, no social security number to Spider-Man. At the same time, J. Jonah Jameson has started writing editorials criticizing Spider-Man, meaning fewer people want anything to do with him, especially when money's involved. Meanwhile, Aunt May is pawning off her jewelry to pay the bills. Shit sucks for Spider-Man right now. So he resolves to join the Fantastic Four, thinking he can get a job with them and make some money to pay off the bills. He breaks into the Baxter building and ends up fighting with the Four in a kind of casual kind of fight. It never gets serious. No one ever uses their immense strength at full power. It's more just he takes a punch from the Thing, evades some attacks, and ultimately learns, though, that the Fantastic Four isn't a company like he thinks of it. It's like a non-profit. It's just a family who work together to save people's lives. He gets pissed off and runs off. And then he fights his first real villain, the Chameleon. Vulture's the next issue. We'll get to that in a bit. So there we have a small skirmish between established heroes where we see Peter is the kid. He is immature. He's fighting people pulling their punches with him, but he's still enduring great strength. He has the skill and power to counter his adversaries, but no one really wants to hurt each other. The Four don't respect Peter at this point. They will, but not at this point. They only know about him because Daily Bugle tells them he's a menace. And he kind of was in their home. This will change over time, especially with Johnny and Peter, who cross paths a lot, become kind of frenemies before being really close friends. In many respects, early Peter bears a similarity to Reed, in that he resolves his problems using wit and intelligence, figuring out the scientific works around his problems to engage with his enemies on an intellectual level. Yeah, he has power, but Reed's greatest strength is his mind. And in the early comics of Spider-Man, Peter's greatest strength was not his powers, which were often balanced out by his opponents, but his intelligence and approach to them. So how is MCU's Peter different? Well, here, Peter is given a Stark internship, which Peter also questions if it's a paid gig, because, money. Tony is also aware of Peter through reputation as an online sensation, a small-town hero in Queens with great potential. In effect, it's an invert of what we saw before. It's not Peter coming to Fantastic Four for a job. It's Tony offering Peter an opportunity. He's not seeking one out, he's being given one. Because Tony is a viewpoint character in Civil War, this makes sense. He has to drive the action with his behavior. So he acts in the narrative, obviously. Civil War is a story defined by Tony and Steve's choices and how it influenced the world's, not Peter's. Peter is affected by Tony's choices. As we'll see, so many people in Peter's life. But Peter is essentially just a pawn of Tony's actions. But for the fight itself, it's a skirmish where Peter demonstrates his ingenuity, strength, and snarky attitude that can back up what he does. While he's just happy to be part of the team and invited to the party, he also arguably shows off his incredible power against foes who don't really want to hurt him, but also aren't pulling their punches all that much. I do think what's funny is how Peter manages to take down Winter Soldier and the Falcon in a few seconds in the same time, but next film struggles with Vulture, implying that Adrian Toomes is actually more dangerous than fucking Falcon and the Winter Soldier. A future Captain America below Adrian Toomes. Just gotta say it right now. He takes on a Hulk, so it's kind of funny how that works out. Vulture versus New Cap would be a fun fight, just saying. This Peter is defined so far by 3 traits. He acts out of a sense of responsibility, he craves approval from those he admires, and despite his lack of combat experience, he exhibits great power coupled with mathematical physical approach to fighting, using physics as his tool to combat his opponents, to balance things out. Now, what do I mean by that exactly? Well, Ant-Man. Talk about Ant-Man. His approach there is he finds an obvious weakness, takes advantage of it, and kind of works around fighting them, using his powers to maneuver and to reassess. It's not really hand-to-hand combat, it's more just looking for a weak point, exploiting that weak point, and taking advantage of it. Be it mobility, undefended territory, or just copying the AT-AT scene in Star Wars. He might not be an experienced hand-to-hand combatant, but he is certainly superior to the Winter Soldier and Captain America in terms of physical power. And his intelligence evens out his fights against bigger foes, like an enlarged Ant-Man. This will come into play in all of the films to follow. But here he's just an admirer of Tony Stark. He has his own story, his identity beyond that, but he's right now just an instrument in Tony's story. So what happened when Spider-Man became his own guy? And why do many still see him as essentially Iron Man Jr.? Spider-Man Homecoming came out the year after Civil War, and immediately the pressure was on, because this is a big fucking deal. This was going to be the first solo film for Spider-Man in the MCU, an introduction to this character who, by all accounts, is the most popular superhero of all time, who had appeared in multiple previous films in different iterations. Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield, to this day, have fans. So he would be compared immediately to those first few films. So how is Tom Holland different? Director John Watts is the second MCU director to direct Spider-Man, meaning his creative influence would have to mesh with whatever the Russos. He had to react to their lead, and that meant John had to be saddled with an inexperienced Spider-Man who felt inexperienced, yet was powerful enough to stop a punch from the Winter Soldier. And I think Watts recaps the events of Civil War very creatively. He shows it from a teenage perspective, a happy, excited Peter who's vlogging the whole thing from the sidelines. And that tone shift allows us to reassess the events of Civil War as Peter's actions driving what's going on. It's an irreverent cell phone vlog, just showing everything just out of focus. He's just happy to be included and is so excited. And that immaturity is both endearing and the beginning of his internal conflict. We then learn that after the fight in Civil War, Tony Stark has kind of not engaged with Peter. He's kind of detached. Peter is trying to get in contact with him for months on end, and he lets him do his own thing around the neighborhood, swinging around and stopping small-scale crime, like he was doing before Tony stepped in. This is the best decision Jon Watts makes over the course of the trilogy, and it's only thanks to the Russos he's forced to walk this back somewhat. We'll get to that in a bit. See, Peter works best in the comics, in film, whatever, because he's the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. The neighborhood has to be a character in the storyline, and I think Homecoming makes Queens a character more than any other film in the trilogy. He helps local people in Queens, he talks to people, he gives directions in the street, he goes to bodegas, he fights gang members, not cosmic level threats, though he can fight a cosmic level threat. His enemies aren't pushovers by any means, but they use their powers for petty ends creatively, and he prevents them from reaching those petty ends. There's a humanity of Spider-Man's villains that you don't see in the bigger cosmic scale stories. With Peter in high school, this trilogy really focuses on the high school years. He goes to a school filled with gifted youngsters, which I think makes sense given how technology has advanced in this storyline. Keep in mind, this is after Tony Stark has pushed his technology throughout all the world, marketing on clean energy and all that. And it's also after Wakanda set up outreach programs. Black Panther takes place before Homecoming. Yeah, I know it was released afterwards, but it's chronologically before Homecoming, meaning the outreach programs to share some technology with the world have already started. Meaning Peter's inheriting a world that's already removed significantly from the real world that we know today. And I think it deals with that pretty well without changing too much. I love some of the analog scenes with the news broadcasts that feel distinctly teenage. There's that teenage lens I love so much in this film. It feels cheap in a way that's difficult. It's effortlessly childish in a way that really puts you in the headspace of a teenager in high school, in ways that aren't as obvious as your standard teen movies do. But what's the conflict of Homecoming? Well, there's two main ones. Stop the Vulture and his gang from dealing weapons throughout the Queens and destroying things, and get Liz to go out with Peter for the homecoming dance. This balance of social and superhero antics, I feel, that intersect is totally Spider-Man. That feels like the early Spider-Man stories entirely. I think this is the best balance of that too, because they feel detached in many ways, while also running in tandem with each other. I'd argue a lot of the earlier films kind of push the superhero stuff aside more to focus on the human drama, which is good for those movies, but here they run back and forth in a way I really like, and tie together very cleverly. Homecoming is the only Spider-Man film I think that feels like a high school story. I know The Amazing Spider-Man is all in a high school too, but the characters feel older. Gwen is an intern at Oscorp, Peter's doing his investigation thing. The only scene from The Amazing Spider-Man that feels really high school-y is that basketball scene, where he shoots hoops with Flash and they show off, and it's all goofy. You could tell me the whole movie takes place in community college, I wouldn't bat an eye otherwise, aside from that one scene. It feels like it could. But hey, at least it isn't the Sam Raimi film, which spends the first third in high school. And even then, doesn't really feel like these characters are high schoolers. It feels like adults playing high schoolers in an obligatory high school setting. I think the film becomes more alive and vibrant when he moves to college with Harry. People forget this, but Peter graduates high school in the comics pretty early on, like 20 issues into The Amazing Spider-Man. The iconic scene from Amazing Spider-Man 33, where Peter is buried under the rubble, that's recreated in Homecoming, directly adapted, that scene takes place after he's already graduated high school. He then spends a large amount of time in college, ESU specifically, the fictional Empire State University. And that issue from Amazing Spider-Man 33 is the culmination of the Stan Lee, Steve Ditko arc, and it takes place after graduation. Their story culminates with him graduating, ultimately, or a little bit after he graduates. The prior two Spider-Man films spend the first movie in high school, but there's no culmination in graduation. Graduation just kind of happens. In the MCU, though, we spend a whole trilogy in high school, which is a lot of time relative to the comics, but Homecoming is the only one that feels anchored in the high school experience in a way that really matters. Again, the school feels lived in. It feels childish in a way that works. Mainly because the storyline is anchored to high school events. The midpoint of the film is an academic decathlon. The third act is centered on the homecoming dance. These are distinctly high school experiences, and they play huge set pieces for the character. Peter contemplates his direction he's going to go with. He wrestles with the idea that people who he idolizes, like Tony Stark, aren't really there to help him out all that much. This feels high schoolish. He's not fully formed yet as a character. He's not totally independent. He's still learning. I think Liz, as a character, she's sweet enough for a temporary love interest, but it's clearly just a superficial crush that Peter has at this time. We know his relationships with Ned and later MJ are going to be more nuanced. And who, by the way, MJ, Why the fuck did they not just lead with her being Mary Jane? Like, I don't understand why they hid, oh, it's Michelle Jones, MJ. I don't get really why they did that, other than to give fans something at the end of the movie to go, I recognize that. I know what that is. I appreciate that Zendaya, who has gone on to become basically a megastar at this point, and Tom Holland's actual in real life wife, she takes a relatively small role in this first film, but tells you everything you need to know about her through very small character beats. The writing doesn't really support her character, it's just Zendaya's talent as an actress that elevates this role in this first film. But that being said though, the real star, it's Ned. in the high school setting. Peter and Ned have great chemistry. It feels real, it reminds me of friends I had in high school, and that kind of dynamic you have there. I love how the two of them throughout the whole trilogy, they got each other's backs, and they're just genuinely chill. I like that. There's a real earnestness that I think is really admirable. But Tom Holland anchors this film as the inexperienced Spider-Man. In Civil War, he had that excitement, but here he has full reign, and it really shows he was perfect for this character, at this film specifically. Peter has his first taste of success at the airport scene, and is just diving for more. He is begging for something else, another chance to prove himself, and gets in over his head, as all great stories do. But this is also the first fault line, isn't it? Peter can fight the Winter Soldier and Falcon. How is the Vulture a threat? Vulture, of course, makes sense for an early Spider-Man story. He was one of the first main villains Spider-Man fought. While Chameleon is technically the first supervillain Peter fought, the Vulture is the first tangible threat in the comics Peter had to really think about outside the box. It's not just simply a guy in disguise who's an agent, it's a guy flying in the sky, outside of the range of his webs really. How do you take that kind of guy down? More than his skill, Peter had to figure out how the Vulture's flight suit worked, how he was flying around, and accordingly, use his talent, his abilities, and intelligence to undermine the Vulture. It's not a fight he could just punch his way out of necessarily. He had to think, and that's good for a storyline and a conflict. Historically, a lot of superhero films just end a big punch out. There's no really intelligent issue, it's just punch the bad guy hard in the face. So this kind of intelligent confrontation doesn't really happen too often in superhero films, where it's not about punching the guy really hard in the face, but finding a solution that solves everything. But their solution is simple. Make Vulture also intelligent and a personal threat to Peter. So you can't just punch him out too quickly. But it makes it also that Peter and the Vulture don't really want to kill each other. They just have goals, and the other guy's in the way of their goals. Michael Keaton as Adrian Toomes is one of Spider-Man's best villains ever. I think the best of the MCU original villains for sure. He's just a guy. I like how he fits into the greater world. He's just a blue-collar worker who got screwed by Tony Stark. A parallel to Peter, who got blessed by Tony Stark. I think this works here specifically. His crew was supposed to clean up after the wreckage in the first Avengers film, the Battle of New York with all the Chitauri and all that. But Tony forms Damage Control to clean up after superhero events, and puts Adrian out of a job. Damage Control, by the way, has since gone on in both Ms. Marvel and Wonder Man to become this actually really dangerous group that regulates superhuman activity, potentially, specifically, mutant activity. And this film really cements that for all the good Tony does, because we've only seen Tony do good in the films up until now, his actions really do have a bad negative effect. Yeah, he made Ultron and all that, but this hurts the little guy on a personal level. He really just screwed Adrian over. So Adrian Toomes, a disgruntled construction worker who now is in the red for renting out all his equipment and is out of a job, he decides, fuck it. Let's just take some of the equipment that they don't care about and sell it for scraps. Sell it in the black market to criminals in the city. I mean, the rubble's already here. Let's just take the technology and repurpose it. His crew consists of some lower level villains like the Tinkerer and the Shocker, and he gives weapons to future villains like the Prowler and the Scorpion. The Brand New Day, especially the Scorpion. But the technology is essentially modified Chitauri tech, and it's modified to perform specific tasks with maximum efficiency. And these tools cancel out Spider-Man's raw strength. You see, raw power isn't going to help someone who has a tool specifically to counterbalance that. Spider-Man might be stronger than his opponents, but they have the tools to neutralize that strength, to even the odds. I don't think Spider-Man lands a single punch in the whole film, because it isn't really that kind of movie. It's more how he tries to struggle against an enemy that is not exactly laterally opposed to him. I like that a lot, actually. It's creative, especially in the era where these big MCU films ended with a guy fighting his evil clone, essentially. As much as I love Black Panther's basically fighting another Black Panther at the end of the film. Here, Peter fights someone who is not an evil Spider-Man, but someone who is completely different, and I love that. Stuff like this goes a long way to make the film feel like a coming-of-age story, like a bigger narrative. It's immature to think you can just rush a bad guy and punch him out. Every time Spider-Man tries, it goes poorly. Either he gets trapped in a big truck, he breaks a boat in half. Every antagonist in this film is an underdog by nature, but not just to Spider-Man, but to the Avengers. So they know what to do to even the odds. They know what to do. But this also makes you kind of root for the Vulture a little bit, right? He is the underdog. He is sticking it to the man who screwed him over. And at the end, when he robs Tony Stark, it's kind of satisfying. It's kind of fun to see that. You're kind of like, yeah, fuck Tony Stark. Take his shit. Of course, the two big scenes in the movie are the Washington Monument set piece and the confrontation in the car where Peter picks up Liz for the homecoming dance and meets Liz's father. Oh wait, it's the Vulture. Her dad's the Vulture, the bad guy you've been fighting this whole time. And now they both know who the other is, and they're in a car together, and they just talk. Keaton is one of the best Batman, I think, historically, because he can flip that switch, go from charming and affable and innocent to downright terrifying while still smiling. And not being overtly frightening, but the implicit threat is there. There's something great about that, and he brings that to that scene. It's so perfect. That scene doesn't work if Tom Holland doesn't play off Michael Keaton perfectly, and if Michael Keaton doesn't play off Tom Holland's insecurity so perfectly. The scene as written is simple, but it's so effective, and more powerful than a big fight would be, because it's more powerful than the fight with them actually ends up being. The smartest thing this film does is focus on characters over raw spectacle. And there is raw spectacle, but it doesn't get in the way of the characterization so much. That's what's important here. Except for a couple characters. Tony and Aunt May. They're the film's biggest weaknesses in my opinion. I think it's great how Tony is this shadow hanging over everything, making Peter feel small, making other characters feel small. The MCU has this big legacy now, and these characters are big figures, and so it makes sense that the average New Yorker would be affected by what they do. It's gods ruining the lives of the little people. I think the scene where Tony takes Peter's suit away before the third act, and that final scene where Peter turns down an invite to the Avengers, is great. It illustrates the changing relationship between Tony and Peter in a way that's really effective, showing Peter both being as an immature teen before developing that immaturity in the final act of the film. That's really good. Peter's refusal to join the Avengers and take the Iron Suit really illustrates Peter's growth. It's a great character beat. However, it's also the film that started the Iron Boy Jr. accusations, and it's not without reason. I think it's acceptable when Peter is here because he's at his most immature as a character. He's the youngest, he's out of his depth. But Peter's suit, in all iterations, he makes the suit. It's his suit. But now it's some electronic Stark tech that Peter doesn't really understand how it works, and then modifies it, and still's out of his depth using. As much as I like Jennifer Connelly, it's weird that Peter has an AI voice talking in his head. It makes no sense. I don't like this. I don't like the suit. I don't like how he gets it back. I really wish it was just without all the bells and whistles attached. The only bell and whistle I like is the eyes. That makes him a little more expressive. That's about it. But even still, he makes a suit later on in Far From Home at the third act of that film. But even then, he's using Stark tech that way. It's only the last scene of No Way Home that Peter makes in his iconic suit using a sewing machine, as God intended, I think. Tony's influence kind of makes Spider-Man feel like a sidekick to Iron Man in this film. And the fact that for the first third, it's basically Peter Parker hoping Mr. Stark notices him, hoping Mr. Stark helps him out, it gets a little grating over time, and it does drag the film down a bit, especially on rewatch, because you know where it's going. The film needed less of Tony Stark. But worse than that, I think Aunt May has almost no role to play anymore. She just kind of exists. The film is so centered in high school that Peter's home life is not as important. And I think the films have always struggled with Aunt May, especially the MCU films, but here it's the clearest. Also, Shocker. Give Shocker his whole fucking suit. He needs to wear the whole damn thing. Either of them, I don't care which. One major criticism against this film, especially by high-top films, is that videos I think have shaped online discourse around the MCU Spider-Man, is that these films lack consequence. I mean, maybe they lack personal consequences for Peter. His decisions won't put Aunt May in, destitution. But still, Tony taking away Peter's suit and forcing him to focus back on his roots, that's a consequence for his actions, his irresponsibilities. But a bodega getting wrecked, property damage, the decathlon, while these don't have personal consequences, they are consequences to the world around Peter. And it's Peter losing touch with who Peter really is. Peter is meant to defend the neighborhood, and seeing a bodega blow up, that's him failing to protect his neighborhood. And it's him focusing on prioritizing being an Avenger over being a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, which is ultimately what leads to the personal consequence of him losing his suit and being forced in the third act to be that defenseless kid he used to be. And also, maybe a hot take, I actually really like the homemade suit. I think it's really cool, and I like how that runs counter to the more mainstream suit. It feels very like Ben Reilly-esque, I think. I dig that. And I think that given the fact he doesn't build another suit until the end of No Way Home using like basic, equipment, I like that detail. That he did make a suit at one point, and it's just antiquated by Tony Stark's gifts. But when he fights the Vulture, he is the pure iteration of the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, wearing just that custom, rough and tumble suit. This is a movie about Peter thinking he's a big deal, only to be brought down to earth again and realizing the important role he plays in his neighborhood. The bodega might not weigh heavily in Peter's conscience, but it's still proof he needs to do better for his neighborhood, because the neighborhood bears a scar due to Peter's actions. Or lack of action. We don't need to necessarily linger on the misery for every second of Spider-Man, and indeed, sometimes you need joy to counterbalance the pain that comes later. And Peter, indeed, experiences a lot of pain as this series continues. In fact, maybe too much pain. Who knows? We'll get to that. Remember, in the original issue that most inspired this comic, Amazing Spider-Man issue 2, which introduced the Vulture and the Tinkerer, Peter has a personal conflict. He needs to make money for his aunt, and then gets that money by taking photographs of himself fighting Vulture and selling them to the Bugle. You can make the argument that JJ is going to use those photos to then attack Spider-Man, which affects his long-term reputation, but he's already doing that, so it doesn't really change anything. The conflict is resolved, there's no super immediate negative consequence for his actions. Not every Spider-Man story needs to end with Peter Parker's good deeds hurting him in some way. Gets closure sometimes. Sometimes things work out. Also, there's a Tinkerer story, which Peter fights Tinkerer and then fights aliens, which has no real long-lasting consequence on anything and is kind of forgotten about by most audiences. The point is that people act like all Spider-Man stories need to have Peter suffer, are not looking at the big picture of the story. Not every story needs to have Peter suffering from some horrible consequence. It's how Peter deals with negative consequences of his actions that is more a core part of Peter's story than necessarily him suffering. The story ends with Mac Gargan wanting Peter's blood, with Liz being publicly humiliated and possibly thrown into poverty now that her dad's in jail, being arrested, exposed as a criminal, that their wealth was formed from stolen goods, stolen from Tony Stark, one of the richest guys in town, in the world. And Peter chooses not to join the Avengers, to be a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. While it is optimistic, there are tinges of disturbing elements in the narrative, and they don't really get resolved until much later. And I, for one, can't wait to see Spider-Man go back to his friendly neighborhood and keep fighting local criminals, like Scorpion. I mean, Scorpion's gonna appear in the next film, right? Right? I think Infinity War and Endgame are a great duo. It's not a flawless finale to the Infinity Saga, but it is pretty damn good. One flaw with that film, sadly, is Spider-Man, in that he essentially doesn't really have a narrative arc in the film, but exists more as an extension of Iron Man's narrative. Completely so. This is where the Iron Boy Jr. thing really comes into full play. The divide between the Russos and Watts becomes really clear with these two films. In Homecoming, Spider-Man rejects Iron Man's Iron Spider suit and the Avengers invite because he wants to be a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. So essentially, in his next appearance, we strip everything he did in the last film away from him. Now, his first scene, it's kind of perfect. Something happens in New York City. Peter Parker sees it, and he jumps in to protect his neighborhood from Thanos' invading forces, and he is then dragged into hijinks afterwards. He immediately is forced into his new suit for his own survival because he's being dragged off into space. On paper, it makes sense why they walk back his choice from the last film, and all of it's in character, it all makes sense, but it also does peel away everything he did previously, all without offering Peter Parker a real internal challenge. And I get why he didn't have one. With the exception of Doctor Strange, none of the characters introduced in Phase 3 undergo a real arc in Infinity War. They're kind of just side characters because the film is itself a payoff to the first 3 phases. They're characters who've been around much longer who need their culmination. Peter Parker's will come later, we get that. But these creative decisions ultimately do impact these films, especially the decision to make Peter a pure extension of Tony's story. The only other character this quickly removed from their familiar world in Infinity War is Thor, and that whole thing is where his entire world is destroyed essentially. It's about his grief and pain across those 2 films, sometimes done very poorly. Add to that, Peter is inconsistent at best power-wise. He absolutely can stand up to Thanos in his fight, and he has those cool battles, but then with Star-Lord, who at this point has lost his celestial powers and is just a normal guy, can put Peter Parker into a chokehold. How did Peter get Peter in a chokehold? I don't know. And I'm low-key convinced that Far From Home having the spider sense play a major role in how that story wraps up is entirely to do with how Peter Parker's spider sense in Infinity War fails to warn him about Peter Quill coming in with a headlock from behind. Should have seen that one coming, Peter. Also, the Iron Spider suit looks like trash compared to the one from the comics. Just saying, it looks way too MCU-ified when the original was sleek, simple, and refined. Even Peter dying in the Thanos snap, that scene is for Tony's story. We never see Aunt May mourning. We don't see Ned, well, Ned disappears too, and MJ too. But Tony, who we know has this minimal contact with Peter previously leading up to this point, gets a sad photo of Peter. That's his emotional resonance to how he ultimately decides to go through with the time heist plan. Looking back at a photo of Peter in Endgame, it's kind of weird, right? How Peter's entire character is anchored in Tony's story. As for Endgame, he's even more of an extension, being the one who cries at Tony's side as he dies, being just a kind of a cool set piece that fights and does cool stuff. Again, he's part of the ensemble. And that happens a lot in comics. A lot of comics do have these ensemble characters who show up for a few key scenes but don't really contribute to the narrative. That's fine in theory. But the Avengers otherwise, up until now, have really balanced characters out in a way that's efficient and good. This is jarring for Peter Parker, especially considering it's his third appearance and he's appeared at this point every year in the MCU. I'm not saying Infinity War or Endgame are responsible for Peter Parker's character falling off, but it is a bit of a problem that we get this and then go straight after Endgame into Far From Home, Peter's next movie, where the baggage of Endgame is carried over, especially considering that Endgame wasn't really a Spider-Man story. So how do you thematically carry the weight of Endgame into your next film? Well, you do it badly is how you do it.
What the hell was that?
Far From Home is generally considered the weakest of the MCU Spider-Man films, by a lot. And yeah, it is. It's easily the worst, but it's not without merit. But at that same time, it's also everything that people say is bad about the MCU Spider-Man in one place. And a lot of that has to do with Infinity War and Endgame. Not all of it, but a lot of it. Watts had to take the baton from two of the biggest films in the franchise, and he did so poorly. This is not entirely Watts' fault, but a lot of blame does lie with Watts for the creative decisions he takes moving forward. Because he has to balance out the teenage John Watts-esque Spider-Man films he's working with the greater context of the MCU hitting its grand finale. Two of its main guys, Captain America and Iron Man, are gone. Black Widow died. What do you do with that? Well, you start with a silly montage at the start, kind of belittling that concept. That irreverent tone is good for some stories, but here it does feel a little off-putting to an extent. It does recapture that same awkward high school vibe that Homecoming had. But it does set you up for a bit of a rough start. But that's not really what I'm talking about when I say Far From Home had to carry up with Endgame. Infinity War completely tied Peter Parker's storyline up with Iron Man, turning him effectively into Iron Boy Jr. And the primary function of Far From Home is to make Spider-Man his own man, separate from Tony. But that's what the first film did. That's what Homecoming did. Peter deals with true loss here, sure, losing Tony, but the way they deal with that, it ties Peter even more to Tony than before. Don't forget, in Homecoming, Peter was his own hero, on his own terms, without Tony's help. That film ends with him rejecting Tony's offer to make him part of the Avengers, to make him a further understudy to Tony Stark. And we focus on this film with him being pressured to become the next Iron Man by Nick Fury and everyone around him, and feeling that pressure from society. Doesn't seem like we're going backwards here. What's Peter's main arc in Far From Home? It's Peter mourning Tony. It's Peter accepting his role in this new world without Tony. Tony's face is everywhere. Skrull Nick Fury is grooming Peter to be the next Iron Man, essentially. The villain this time around is even more tied in with Tony Stark than the Vulture was. Edith, the MacGuffin of the film, is a Stark weapon that Tony gives to Peter as kind of a piece of him inheriting Iron Man's mantle, essentially. The lowest point of this movie in the third act is all about Peter dealing with Tony's loss in his life and trying to live up to those expectations. The biggest emotional beats are centered on Tony Stark. Even even that great sequence, the nightmare sequence that Mysterio puts Peter Parker through, the culmination, it's Tony Stark's tombstone. Tony Stark has a massive shadow over this film, way more than in Homecoming, possibly even more than in Infinity War. At least in Infinity War, you can make the argument that Peter is with Tony actively in the story. Tony Stark is not in this movie, but Far From Home has other problems too that are worth mentioning that got lost in discussion. For one, it once again drags Peter Parker away from the friendly neighborhood and into Europe. On one hand, it's cool to get to different locations. We never had Peter Parker in Europe before, but the problem is they don't do anything with the setting. This film doesn't need to take place in Europe. None of the set pieces really depend on Europe as a unique location. It doesn't really fit into the plot all that well. The only value that Peter has on this trip is a sense of scale. That's it. Early on, it's a cool set piece where Peter Parker faces Hydro Man. Well, an illusion meant to look like a Hydro Man, basically. And that whole thing takes place in Venice or whatever. And that really can take place anywhere because it doesn't really utilize the setting all that well outside of there being landmass and water. But that could be taking place, that could be on a dock or, any place like that. It doesn't really matter at all, does it? The entire third act takes place on a bridge. That could be any bridge. It doesn't feel like any of these locations are really central to what's happening. They're just exotic locales, but the fight scenes take place on locales that could be in New York just as easily as Britain. The elementals emerging different points around the world, sure, that might feed into Mysterio's whole theatrics, but it doesn't add up to Peter's story, which all that we do with the vacation is it just isolates Peter from New York City and Aunt May. What this essentially does is it removes Peter from the core tenets of who Peter is, a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. After Infinity War and Endgame, we want to see Peter Parker be that friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. And then he's not in the neighborhood. They immediately take him out of the neighborhood again. So we don't get a sense of who Peter is in his home location. And it sucks especially because there was a whole short film's worth of material removed from Far From Home that was later released as his own short film where Peter Parker's doing his thing in New York City. That should have been in the movie. You can feel the absence there without something fun happening in Queens, in the local neighborhood that Peter Parker's supposed to defend. It throws off the pacing because we keep just dive into Europe. What's the value in that? Why do we even take ourselves out of the setting so quickly that we know Peter Parker is anchored to most? But now, it's not bad if your second film takes your hero out of his element. That's fine. Captain America Winter Soldier and Black Panther Wakanda Forever both deal with their central characters being taken out of familiar territory. The Winter Soldier drags Captain America from the 40s to the modern era, forced with a new political standard that pushes him in morally questionable ways. Wakanda Forever had to deal with the real-life passing of Chadwick Boseman, and now we have this power vacuum in Wakanda. Add to that the idea that there's another society with vibranium that's totally different from Wakanda. Both these films do a great way of balancing the disconnect with what came before to create an emotionally resonant narrative. Far From Home does not do that. It's still a teen story, just a vacation teen story. One thing I didn't mention before is that the first Spider-Man film has a real John Hughes vibe, right? But if Homecoming is drawing from 16 Candles or The Breakfast Club, Far From Home is drawing more from stuff like The Great Outdoors, which, I like The Great Outdoors, it's a good movie, but that vacation film works because it takes some drastically different characters, puts them into little scenarios anchored in the vacation setting, and has fun with it. We don't do that here. Far From Home never properly utilizes its setting outside of it being away from New York. So we remove Peter Parker from familiar territory, right? We ape a subgenre of comedy from the 80s, and we fail to actually incorporate what made those comedies good in this film. There's no foils here that really make a difference. There's no situational comedy or situational fight scene that really feels unique to these particular settings. Because we're traveling across Europe so quickly, we never settle into any location. None of these places feel like a character in themselves, just a different backdrop. It's easy to even forget where you actually are unless there's something telling you specifically we're in this part of the world. Everything feels like it could have taken place in New York City and they wouldn't make a difference. Except, would have made a difference, it would have been at least anchored to the city that Peter Parker's trying to defend. But there's other things too, like the failure to incorporate Nick Fury. Fury is here as Peter's essential boss, really. Fury's trying to pressure Peter into being the next Iron Man, a hero who addresses large conflicts. Again, a retread of what happened in Homecoming and before, where Peter Parker was confronted with all his drive to be an Avenger and chose to relinquish it. So we're just going back to what was there before. These scenes read a lot like Ultimate Spider-Man, where Nick Fury, the version that most inspired Samuel Jackson's version actually, is there to kind of groom Peter Parker to being a major superhero for the Ultimates, their version of the Avengers. He's constantly trying to make him take on bigger responsibilities. And at first, Peter Parker is kind of goes with it, and Nick Fury is this cool, aloof figure who drives Peter into bigger stories. But that quickly changes as tension builds between Peter and Fury, especially around the time the Hobgoblin shows up, because Peter is pressured to go against his ethical code under Fury. Kind of like what happens with Captain America and Winter Soldier, but, so we've done that already. But all that doesn't really matter in Far From Home because it's not Nick Fury, it's a Skrull. We're not dealing with the head of S.H.I.E.L.D., we're talking about a guy standing in for Nick Fury. And besides, this Nick Fury's dumb enough to fall for Mysterio's plans, so who cares even? Nick Fury is tertiary, the most tertiary MCU cameo in this franchise. And he's only there to set up a plot that leads to Secret Invasion, the worst thing the MCU has ever made. Yeah, I said it. MJ and Ned, they're good. I mean, Ned's whole comedy romance with Freddie Branch, that's at least funny. It kind of works in a goofy kind of way, though it doesn't really add much, but at least it feels like the vacation comedy teen story that we're kind of trying to lift from here. The MJ romance, that works just as well too. Yeah, there's no setup for the romance before this film, but I can buy the fact he has a crush on her now. That's not too unreasonable for me. He's a teenager. It happens. What I don't like is the whole happy Aunt May romance thing that's kind of forced and weird and awkward and feels pointless, especially considering that they break up next film anyway. But there's one thing I've avoided mentioning up till now, and that's Mysterio, because I'm extremely divided in how I feel about him, though more one way than the other. On one hand, yeah, Mysterio is even more tied into Iron Man than the Vulture was. The Vulture was just a guy who was impacted by Tony Stark, and he went off to be his own guy, making money his own way. But Mysterio is entirely driven by his petty grudge over Tony using his invention without giving Beck the proper credit for making it or whatever. It's super petty and stupid. He assembles a team of ex-Stark employees, including the guy from A Christmas Story, and he wants to be the next Iron Man, essentially, a great hero who becomes a savior, but only by using the powers that Iron Man happened to relinquish. He's taking the tools of his ex-boss to make himself look better. And all that feels lazy and derivative of this to an already exhausting degree to which Iron Man drags Peter Parker's film into Iron Boy Jr. territory. But if you look past all that, I kind of love Mysterio. A lot of y'all sleep on him. It's pretty great. In effect, Mysterio's arc is like the original comic. In Amazing Spider-Man 13, he becomes a hero, quote unquote, becoming a public figure. In that first comic, he pretends to be Spider-Man doing crimes and vows to catch Spider-Man in the act, essentially creating a scenario that he can exploit for profit. And he also takes advantage of the Bugle's grudge against Spider-Man to further prop himself up. However, what happens is Peter Parker ends up stopping him. That all goes backwards. Now, ironically, compared to this, the next issue, Amazing Spider-Man 14, that is a travel story, kind of like what Far From Home is. Peter is stuck in a cave with the Hulk on a movie set. It's kind of fun stuff. There's also some obscure character who shows up in that book, some big bad guy. I'm sure he didn't go on to do anything important, though, in Amazing Spider-Man 14. But now, back to the original comic, the 13. Peter Parker tricks Mysterio into confessing his crimes while he records Mysterio confessing said crimes, which is kind of a reverse of what Mysterio does in this film, where he frames Spider-Man for his murder by filming and releasing certain components of his final moments. What I love is everything about Mysterio is complete bullshit. He presents himself as this glorious figure, even to his crew, but he's really just nothing. He's a pathetic small man. Like, sure, he is clever, but he's mostly just a petty, cruel bastard. Unlike Peter, who has this incredible power, but feels the responsibilities weighing down on him. He's insecure in himself. He doesn't think he deserves or can fulfill these big expectations for him. Mysterio chases that role, even though he can't actually fill it. And I love how he gets everything he wants by tricking and exploiting the anxieties of a child. But that bites him in the ass when that child strikes back. And it's very, very clear Mysterio never had a chance fighting Peter. He has to subvert it. Again, playing into that idea that the powers these characters have do not directly counter each other. Once Peter gets to Mysterio, it's done in seconds, because he just has more power than Mysterio. He's stronger, has better abilities. He trusts his senses, his spider sense, to confront Mysterio in a sequence that's genuinely really cool. And I like it. I wish we had more scenes exploring the spider sense like that in such a complex, interesting way. But it is a little disappointing that Mysterio goes down so quickly. That's a bit of a bummer, I do admit. At this point, Mysterio is the only Spider-Man villain to die in his film, which is disappointing. Well, let's see more of him. I know a lot of people feel like Peter falling from Mysterio's act is bad writing. It's not really. It fits Peter's trusting perspective. He trusted Tony outright. He trusts Doctor Strange outright. Honestly, mixing the Tony grief more into Mysterio would have been better suited, I think. With Peter projecting Tony Stark onto Quentin Beck, seeing him as the new Iron Man essentially, more directly in the plot. That would be more effective than just having Peter and Happy flat out talking about grief in the airplane, I think. There were better ways of incorporating it. Mysterio's like the opposite of the Vulture in many ways. He's not a guy who wants to make a living in extraordinary times. He's a guy who thought he was above the extraordinary times, and kind of is in some ways. People get annoyed that Vulture and Mysterio don't have a core centered focus on Spider-Man from the start, but I like this decision. These guys are just criminals who happen to bump into Peter. He is an obstacle for them. Much like in the comics, many of Peter's villains aren't really obsessed with Peter Parker as a character. They have other goals, and Peter gets in the way of said goals. I like that dynamic. It's a little fleshed out, it's interesting, and we get a sense of how these different personality types really collect with each other. One thing I love is how in the whole Watts trilogy, there is no opposite of Peter Parker villain he fights. There's no Venom, there's no Doppelganger, there's no Kane. It's just guys who have powers, who have all the strength, but have zero responsibility with how they use it. That's all it is. It's great. And also, though a lot of people complain about the CG in these movies, that hallucination scene with Mysterio, it's freaking great. I know people complain about overuse of CG, sure. When it's used artfully and creatively, that's good. We need more scenes like that that create the impossible before us, rather than the common, like a background in a wall set or something like that, like a street corner. Also, because Mysterio frames Peter Parker for murder, Peter goes and gets his wish with Doctor Strange in No Way Home, which means Mysterio is indirectly accountable for nearly collapsing all of reality. The ripple effects of a guy pretending to be from the multiverse, it's incredible. But the real way to know Mysterio's fake?
There are multiple realities, Peter. This is Earth, Dimension 616. I'm from Earth 833. We share identical physical constants, level 4 symmetry.
I'm sorry, you're saying there's a multiverse? Because I thought that was just theoretical. I mean, that completely changes how we understand the initial singularity. It's insane. Sorry.
This isn't Earth 616, you dumbass. It's Earth 1999999.
Don't even get me started on Doctor Strange and the little nerd back on Earth 199999.
Yeah, I guess that's true, I suppose. But yeah, is that enough to salvage Far From Home as a film? I mean, in some ways, but not really. Like, the film does feel unambitious, retreading old ground. It feels like setup for No Way Home. It ends up feeling fleshed up by the MJ bits a bit, sure, but it's more like a transition than a full film. It's easily the most forgettable Spider-Man film ever made, I think. It's not as aggressively annoying or bad as The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is, and definitely like the spin-off Sony tried putting out, but it's also not as clownish as Spider-Man 3 is, where it's kind of fun to make fun of it a little bit. You can't have fun with the bad that this kind of film projects. But also, some people are a little over the top with it. I mean, like, listen, people point out how the film makes jokes at the expense of Endgame's losses, sure. Makes light of it too much, maybe. But that's not really the problem. I know it rubbed people the wrong way, made a comment about it early on, but they don't really drown Far From Home. The jokes aren't the problem. It's the lack of connectivity to the greater Spider-Man story, and the overconnectivity to Tony Stark's story. The greater MCU doesn't drag this film down so much as the inability for this film to balance out the greater MCU. Making the film feel like a follow-up to Tony's story more than Peter's story is the big problem. But because of that, it feels like stuff we've seen already. The film is sandwiched between two better films that help establish its rep even more as the weakest of the Tom Watts films. No Way Home is the most controversial Spider-Man film in the MCU. Not necessarily because it's the best or it's the worst, but rather because there's really no consensus on it, even years later. Is it a showcase of Spider-Man's decade-spanning cinematic history? Is it a colossal fan service event with no real substance behind it? Is it proof that Tom Holland's entire trilogy was essentially an extended origin story for the Spider-Man we know and love? Nothing more than Amazing Fantasy 15 dragged out for 3 films plus crossovers? Or is the culmination of a fully realized arc more effective than most of the arcs in the MCU? I'd argue yes to all of that, all at once. It's all of those things at the same time. No Way Home is very obviously hampered by various production issues, from the pandemic to the shuffling around of Marvel films, in part because of the pandemic. And these issues are very clear to see, and the sometimes ugly compositing shots and the shoddy special effects that to put it generously, can sometimes seem unfinished or amateur in some cases. Many scenes are obviously staged and paced to allow people to scream and cheer in the theater, and when you leave the theater and watch it at home, you can tell. The final film is left with several hanging, awkward pauses that feel manufactured, more obvious on each rewatch, and maybe hamper your enjoyment of the film. However, at that same time, I do think as a film, No Way Home is inferior to Homecoming, but it is superior as a cinematic experience. It's a more fun film to watch, even knowing where it all goes, entirely due to it fully realizing a fleshed out multiverse in which Spider-Man not only exists, but is an instrumental role. No other film in the MCU has made Spider-Man feel more important to its fate than No Way Home. The film can roughly be divided between its 3 acts, as each one has a unique conflict that feels divorced from the other. It's almost like watching 3 episodes of a TV show, back to back. Act 1 is the fallout from Mysterio, with Peter having to deal with his identity now being public, with Jameson now harping for his arrest, and the ramifications this has in his life in part thanks to Damage Control, the same organization that Tony Stark built all those years prior that first forced the Vulture into villainy. I do like how Damage Control comes back even briefly in this capacity, especially seeing as how Damage Control will take a similar role in both Ms. Marvel and Wonder Man. And it's thanks to Matt Murdock that Spidey mostly avoids legal consequences, as do his extended family and friends. But that doesn't mean he escapes scot-free. He still has consequences for his own actions. Half of the public outright hates him for the death of Mysterio, blaming him for his murder, who they see as a real hero. He struggles to get by, but he especially struggles to get into his choice university, MIT. Ned and MJ are similarly rejected due to association with Peter. And I actually love this bit, because it's pure Spider-Man. Peter did the right thing across multiple films, but it's not enough. It's not enough to curb the negative consequences from critically impacting his life and the lives of those around him. Unfairly, even. They all did the right thing, and they're being punished for it. It doesn't matter if you're a hero, you still gotta suffer. And that's classic Spider-Man. I love it. That's why we love Spider-Man so much. That's relatable. In a story that's more idealized, the hero always walks away on top. Spider-Man is not that. Even when he wins, he still loses. Which leads him to turn to Doctor Strange, out of desperation, who offers to rewrite reality, essentially, to erase the memory of Peter being Spider-Man in the minds of the entire world. However, as Peter keeps changing the terms of his wish and what he really wants, the spell gets more complicated, compiling and doubling down on itself until it results in a corrupted spell. And it drags villains from across reality, from across multiverses, into Peter's own reality. Funny how that works out, isn't it? One reoccurring thing in Phase 4 is that Doctor Strange keeps screwing things up in the multiverse. He's kind of prone to multiversal calamities, from What If having his whole reality collapse upon him, to everything in Multiverse of Madness. He's all too eager to rewrite reality on a whim, but then judges Peter for convincing Doctor Strange to cast the spell when none of them considered just asking the MIT administrations for the position back. I love how Strange also volunteers all this information in the zone, and Peter doesn't bother contacting the college out of not knowing he can do that. It's almost like the adults in his life should be able to give him advice that's useful. And look, as someone who hates even making a phone call to my local energy company when the lights go off, I relate to this so much. It's such a relatable thing, not knowing you can just call the companies or call the organizations and negotiate your terms. One thing about Doctor Strange that I think actually works really well for this film, and something a lot of people overlook in these films in general, is the arcs Peter's mentors go across. Not so much as characters, but in terms of the role they play in Peter's life. First is Tony Stark, then Skrull Nick Fury, and now Dr. Stephen Strange. And all 3 are in some way or another fucking awful mentors for Peter. Tony is a distant guy who leaves Peter feeling unwanted and undervalued, while also inspiring the creation of organizations like Damage Control that kind of make things worse for Peter Parker's life throughout his entire tenure. Nick Fury, who, again, is actually a Skrull and not the real Nick Fury, because he's off gallivanting the cosmos, puts unrealistic expectations onto Peter, forcing him to conform to standards outside of his own wheelhouse. And Doctor Strange, well, he just screws everything up. His life is entirely driven by having great power and using it irresponsibly. I wonder if that ties into anything else. All three other Marvel characters fail Uncle Ben's classic motto, now given to Aunt May here. With great power comes great responsibility. Iron Man has immense power, both as a hero and as a billionaire scientist. But almost all the problems Peter has faced up until now are due to Tony's failure to understand the ramifications of his own actions. Then again, most of the problems of the MCU are due to Tony not knowing the ramifications of his own actions, aka Ultron. He's careless with his power, even though he means well with it. Nick Fury as a Skrull, he's just all around terrible. Just a bad mentor, dumb spy. You kind of suck, Skrull Nick Fury. But Doctor Strange is the most interesting example here, because with him, it's more nuanced. He is trying to help Peter out, genuinely, using the skills he has available. He understands the ramifications of his own actions and chastises Peter for not knowing those same ramifications. He fails to tell Peter what he's actually doing and fails to communicate the full scope of his lessons onto Peter before he does them. Which again makes sense. He is the ex-Sorcerer Supreme, after all. He lost that privilege. And he leads through a spell being poorly concocted, corrupted, and ultimately pointless, when you think of an easier way to execute a solution quickly after. It's an example of power being used irresponsibly. It's not the smartest choice, but it's not meant to be either. And people kind of don't get that when they talk about this. They think, it's even Doctor Strange being stupid. Why did he do something so stupidly? Well, because he has great power, but no responsibility. He thinks he does, but he's actually one of the most irresponsible characters across the multiverse. In his next sequel, after all, he finds out firsthand he constantly causes awful things to happen because of his lack of responsibility. I think it's in part because of learning from Peter Parker's example here that the current Doctor Strange actually learned something about how to deal with the multiverse as a whole. Through that lens, you can make the argument that Doctor Strange only succeeds in his next film because he learns from Spider-Man. The guy he's supposed to mentor actually taught him a few things. I kind of like that. In each film, though, Peter does learn something from his mentors. He does the opposite of what they do. Everything that the Marvel characters who are established do in Peter's movies, Peter does the opposite, and that's what gets him ahead. He learns from the failure of his superiors, in a sense. At least Doctor Strange treats Peter like a grown-up. Everyone else talks down to Peter like some kid, but it's a step up, I think, with Doctor Strange. He treats him as a peer. Mysterio also did, but that's a whole other story right there for another day. The previous day, really. It's now that all the other villains show up, and the movie quickly enters its second act, where we get to a gotta catch 'em all storyline, where Peter goes around and captures the villains brought into his reality. The initial fight on the bridge with Doc Ock is one of the highlights of the film. I like again how it's a demonstration of two seasoned foes fighting one another, even though they're not really seasoned with each other, but you get the idea. And how the solution isn't as simple as just Peter punching Ock hard in the face, but rather exploiting technology to beat him. They're both skilled, but the victory is non-linear. I think that's kind of cool. I love how Sandman has his nebulous fluid role in the story, siding first with Peter, and then siding against Peter with the other villains. Kind of like what he does ultimately in Spider-Man 3. That makes him feel more in line with the character we met in Spider-Man 3, though, again, I do wish we had some more mention of his family or what have you. I feel like he is very much floating in the story, and that kind of works with Sandman. He kind of doesn't fit anywhere properly. Lizard's the only villain that comes back that's really disappointing, because I really wish this character justice. The Lizard is such a fascinating character, the whole Jekyll and Hyde thing. I know it's very similar to what happens with Goblin in this film, but I do wish he was more than just trying to turn the whole world into lizards and be all animalistic and crazy. It's more shocking he's there than anything else. But the two figures that are most notable here, of course, are Electro and the Green Goblin, both of whom take on a primary antagonist role. Electro leads the loose assembly of villains against Peter to get what they need, and Green Goblin, well, he almost destroys the entire multiverse long before Doomsday. The fact that Green Goblin, of all villains, almost causes a multiversal incursion is kind of wild. Does that make Green Goblin a bigger threat to the multiverse than Thanos? I don't know to tell you, man. That's pretty crazy to me. Electro is ultimately the peak version of the character in terms of adaptation from the comics. He's a power-hungry guy, a nobody turned into a monster, who isn't so much evil as he is driven by his own reckless ambition, which leads him to greater power. I think this movie does a much better job establishing his relationship with Spider-Man than The Amazing Spider-Man 2 does, which I maintain is the worst Spider-Man movie, easy. It's the worst mainline one by a far margin, by a substantial margin, completely so. But come on. Norman Osborn steals the show. This is the villain who started the entire cinematic saga for Spider-Man, coming back to quickly establish why he is the worst. He fucks up Peter's life more in this movie than anyone ever has. He is a menace. He fucks up Tom Holland's world way worse than Tobey's world life, because he actually takes a life. The film allows Goblin to be a true force of chaos, despite only showing up really in a few key moments. He's barely in the movie, but you feel him throughout. It's just brilliant to let Willem Dafoe actually emote, rather than rely on that weird stiff mask of his. His face is so much more Goblin-like than any mask could ever be. He is, simply put, a menace to society. I love the concept of reoccurring villains in films so much. It's one of the things about the X-Men films I love with Magneto coming back every so often. In Spider-Man comics, I love how you have different fights with the same bad guy, and it can illustrate at different points in their lives how everyone can change for better or for worse. It's why I love Doc Ock's role in this story, even though it's minimal, even though it's small. It's why I love seeing Electro and Andrew Garfield just chill and chat like old friends after the fight. It's why I love seeing Norman 1 minute crying in Aunt May's feast organization building, and the next dropping a pumpkin bomb on Aunt May and killing her. Just vials, just, fun comic book things like, murder. When it comes to the second act, there are a few huge highlights, and they might not be the highlights you're thinking of. I mean, let's be honest. The first big thing is I love how Peter chooses to save his villains rather than just kill them outright. That's a big thing with the MCU that I have a problem with. Most of the films are about the hero trying to stop the villain, but usually in terms of raw destructiveness. I think Ant-Man and the Wasp is the only one that tries to save its villain more than kill them. But Peter demonstrates immense empathy towards those he fights, all the way back in Homecoming, where he saves Adrian Toomes from his own exploding wings. I think he would have tried saving Mysterio in Far From Home if the guy wasn't a total dick. I think his decision to want to save every single villain, despite not knowing who they are, despite not knowing where they come from, is honestly indicative of the type of character Peter is. It's one reason why this version of Peter is so good, because he is genuinely so generous and kind even to those who hurt him. And that adds a lot of richness to his character. Is it naive? Yeah. Is it dumb sometimes? Sure. But it's earnest, and it's honest. Whenever people act like No Way Home isn't a character-driven story, I look at all the scenes where there's no action. It's just characters hanging out. Yeah, someone's on a green screen set, obviously not together, or maybe a soundstage, but they're just chatting, talking, interacting. Is all the dialogue good? No. Some of it's a little cringe, but that's alright. The spectacle overshadows these smaller bits, but the smaller bits are what ground the spectacle in something material. None of it works if you don't enjoy seeing these characters interact, even when it is a little cringe. Norman even has this admiration for Peter that carries over into his fights as the Goblin. It creates this really fascinating dynamic where you're not sure if the Goblin wants to destroy Peter or raise him up in some sick kind of way. It's quite interesting. I also love the conflict that brews between Peter Parker and Doctor Strange. Strange understands the ramifications of his own actions, way more than he lets on at first. He tries to repair everything to bring it back to the way it was, even if that means condemning villains to their fates. He knows if he sends the villains off to their own timeline, they might die. Yeah, it'll stop the incursions from happening, but doing so will also send them to the moments right before their own dooms. And Peter can't let that happen. He can't act knowing he's going to condemn these people to their deaths. He wants to fix them and save them before sending them back so they can lead better lives, have the potential to do great things, because he knows they're all capable of being great people. And this culminates in a fight where Doctor Strange, who, by the way, is immensely more powerful than Spider-Man, is beaten by Spider-Man. He loses, unambiguously. His ass gets kicked by a guy with no knowledge of the mystic arts. Just a high school science degree. One thing I've been addressing throughout is how none of the villains Peter fights are people who he overpowers. He finds clever solutions around whatever things are counterbalancing the power set. So that means he is used to not just overpowering a villain, but finding a clever solution. The same is true for Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange has worked to fight immensely more powerful foes than himself, but uses clever solutions. Peter just happens to use the laws of physics in the mirror dimension to overwhelm Doctor Strange. And this marks Peter as one of the only characters, not the only, but one of the only, to outright beat Doctor Strange in a fight. Not escape with their lives and negotiate out of the way of a battle, but to just unambiguously win. That's pretty neat, I think. And then the culmination of Peter trying to help his villains, the Goblin comes out and destroys everything. A force of chaos, a monkey wrench in the system, and it culminates in Goblin killing Aunt May. One reoccurring fault with the MCU version of Spider-Man is how minimal of a role Aunt May plays. And so this scene may be damn near perfect. It's a great sequence with a lot of build-up that feels both out of nowhere and also the culmination of all the consequences up until this point. But the problem is it builds upon other movies that didn't build up to this. Aunt May's death at the hands of Green Goblin is a flawless scene in isolation, but is marred by the lack of emotional build-up we've had towards Aunt May across the 2 previous times she showed up, and not counting Civil War. I guess 3 times then, I guess? We didn't necessarily need Marissa Tomei to channel Rosemary Harris's melancholic but powerful speeches like in Spider-Man 2, but we needed more emotion before this. More signs of Aunt May being there for Peter. Because Peter has so many parental figures in the MCU, her Aunt May's roles diminish some. How much more powerful would it have been if, in Far From Home, for example, Peter's emotional conversation about not being enough, to not being like Tony Stark? What if that happened not with Happy Hogan, but with Aunt May, where Aunt May is able to mother her nephew a little bit more? How much better would it have been if more of these emotional scenes played out with Aunt May? We got a real sense where she could give some emotional pep talk of some kind. I think it would have been better. I think it would have been much better. And again, a lot of that stems from Far From Home not being in New York City. That is a huge flaw with the trilogy. Far From Home really does drag down the trilogy in so many ways because it squanders the necessary role it was in transitioning from one extreme to the other. But the moment where Tom Holland is standing in the rain as J.K. Simmons, J. Jonah Jameson delivers a soul-crushing speech, a monologue that bites down to the heart of what Spider-Man thinks about himself, the insecurities, the knowledge that he will forever cause problems to others by association with them. That's powerful stuff. J.K. Simmons remains one of the highlights across all of these films as J. Jonah Jameson, even if his role here is basically just Alex Jones from InfoWars. It's diminished, sure, but it's powerful. He takes the moments as this grifter and turns it into one of the most earnest performances of all time, even though, again, would have been better as the more honor-bound but biased editor-in-chief of the Bugle, I think. But then we get Ned bring the other 2 Spider-Men into the story, and the 3rd act kicks off. Act 2 ends with a bang, but Act 3 is what makes this film feel like an event. Many fans point to the 3rd act as either the breaking point of the film or the making point of the film. Either it composites so much fan service upon itself it collapses into a black hole, or elevates a mediocre film to supremacy. I don't know if I agree with any of those takes. I think the film works up until that point, and this feels like a culmination of what came before, in the best possible ways. What makes this work, the reunion of the Spider-Man, unlike, say, how The Flash has these exhausting scenes where dead actors are brought to life. The fact it's driven in character moments, character beats, character interactions. The various scenes of Peter talking with Peter. They're just yapping and chatting and conversing, and it really changes the vibe so effectively. I love how Garfield has these moments where he's able to make up for failing to save Gwen by saving MJ. I like how Toby is able to talk to Doc Ock, and after all this time. I love how they make these jokes and quips. I love how the Avengers come up and both Spider-Man have no idea what they are.
I was in the Avengers. The Avengers? That's great. Thank you. What is that?
I love how Andrew and Toby feel like mentors to Tom because they've been through this shit before. It's improvised and organic in so many ways. I know it's scripted, but it feels improvised and organic in the best possible way. Not formless, but human. After so many films where Peter is looked down on by his fellow Marvel peers and treated like he needs to be something other than himself, it's refreshing to see him find comfort in knowing he can be his own hero with people who understand him because they've been through it before. There's something so powerful about seeing him talk with himself and give himself, essentially, the moral pep talk and hug, spiritually, that he needs. It elevates every version of Spider-Man to be something greater than themselves. It's one of those fan service bits that elevates everything that came before, bringing all three different universes in culmination with each other, where they're all able to reunite and elevate themselves beyond the failings and fallings they've suffered in the past. It's something beautiful, and it's the best kind of multiversal story. Not one that brings down what came before or cheapens it into just being fan service, but something that does feel like a natural convergence of what was great previously, and a celebration of what was great previously, without demeaning it. And then there's that final battle. It's cool as hell. You know what happens. Doctor Strange has the spell contained. All these heroes are fighting. They all unite. Doc Ock has a good moment of redemption. The Green Goblin destroys the box containing the spell with a pumpkin bomb. And Spidey chooses to save the Goblin over enacting revenge. Even though Toby gets pretty badly injured. I thought he was going to die in that scene, but he's alright. But it doesn't stop the spell from going crazy and opening up the multiverse. Now, every multiverse that has a Peter Parker in it is converging on Peter, and Peter has to end up saving all of reality in this moment by making a drastic sacrifice. A greater sacrifice than maybe any hero in the MCU has up until this point, other than like, losing your life, whatever. Everyone in the world will forget Peter Parker exists entirely. He will be alone on this world, the only man who knows he was real. In many ways, this is the ultimate culmination of the Watts trilogy. If Homecoming had minimal consequences, which was criticized when it came out, this is the culmination of cascading consequences. This is the result of all that came before. This is the film that illustrated lasting consequences from film to film for Spider-Man. Far From Home focused on the fallout from Endgame, and it impacted Peter's life in many ways. It was a little short-sighted in some regards, and it did feel like it dominated the plot, but it does start something, because now we see the fallout from Far From Home. His decision to become his own man has an immediate impact on Peter. The training wheels are off, and it results in bad things happening even when you win. Peter does everything right for everyone across everywhere, and he still loses. He can never enjoy any of his success. Victory only brings Peter into the worst, lowest state of his life. He has no access to technology that he took advantage of before. He has no family. He loses his friend. He loses his girlfriend. He has lost everything. He has lost more than any Spider-Man has before, and does it without hesitation because it's the right thing to do. The film is ultimately criticized more often than not for being fan service. But at the core of No Way Home, it's the story of someone learning about what consequences can do. It's about being a hero, despite knowing you will lose everything in the process. It's about someone learning that your life will now end. There truly is no way home after this. Watts' trilogy is uneven, but it ultimately speaks louder about the consequences of being Spider-Man, more than any previous film had. In its final act, the 6 films before that lead up to this, both across the Russos and the Watts films. We get Spider-Man going from this casual little kid who's saving people on the streets, recklessly perhaps, but selflessly, to Peter becoming a hero greater than the Avengers. In one film, he accomplishes more than the Avengers did across both of Endgame and Infinity War. This is where Peter becomes truly Spider-Man. He goes off to college on his own, to be his own man, sure, but not before doing more to salvage reality than any hero up until this point had. And that leads us to Brand New Day. Everything you just saw was written and edited before I saw Brand New Day. I wanted to draft a complete understanding of John Watts' trilogy and the Russo brothers saga before we saw where Destin Daniel Cretton took his own film. In many ways, Brand New Day feels like what happens whenever a new writer starts a new run, after a particularly dramatic end to a previous writer's run. The original Brand New Day storyline was a follow-up to One More Day, the highly controversial storyline. Like in No Way Home, we see the end of Peter Parker's relationship to MJ, though that one is Mary Jane Watson. Although I would argue that the differences make No Way Home feel more tragic, while One More Day is incredibly frustrating. One More Day focused on Peter Parker trading his marriage to Mephisto in order to save Aunt May's life after the Kingpin had an assassin shoot her. However, with No Way Home, Peter has a scenario that could only be solved by having the memory of him be erased. His identity vanished. Only way to solve the incursion problem. One More Day is a self-serving decision to allow Peter to regress to a pre-marriage state for the audience's eternal youthful fantasies, while the other, No Way Home, is part of Peter growing up, being forced to mature. Although I do feel it's ironic that both end up going to the same real era in the comics, both going back to the 80s before Peter Parker was married. The original Brand New Day is an anthem of regression, turning back the clock. This Brand New Day feels like a step closer to maturity, a new era for Peter Parker, reminiscent of his late 70s and 80s persona. So it's kind of odd how they're coming at the same era from different angles. All of that is to say this is the start of a new story that builds upon what came before rather than regress to a clean slate. Peter Parker's arc is ultimately what all great Spider-Man stories are about, balancing out the spider with the man. Where does the costume end and the life begin? When we start, Peter is effectively friendless with no social circle whatsoever. He has some technology to help with his research that is bizarrely expensive for a poor guy living on his own. Probably a remnant of his last life with Tony Stark, but it's also possibly the product of dumpster diving or refurbishing old, cheap equipment. Or, magic product placement. I do question where he gets his money for all this stuff, is what I'm saying. We know some things that happened off screen, like Spidey saving the Punisher's life, but there's a lot that happens we're not told about, and that's not terrible. It allows the focus to be on the emotional journey. Parker's only friend is basically Jean DeWolf, a cop who's friendly with Spider-Man, and a character I suspect will die next movie because Jean DeWolf is famous for one specific storyline, and that storyline is titled The Death of Jean DeWolf. Spoilers as to what happens in that one. MJ and Ned exist, but Peter can only parasocially watch them via social media. While Peter could just reintroduce himself and bring himself into their lives, he chooses not to because he blames himself for getting Aunt May killed by the Green Goblin. Once again, we see that the previous villain has caused lasting damage to Peter. In No Way Home, Mysterio has doxed him and he's affected by that, and in this, Peter is racked by guilt thanks to the Green Goblin. I do like how that kind of makes the previous villains feel more significant based on how much lasting harm they've done to our characters. This pattern allows each previous film to feel more impactful because it had long-lasting consequences. I like how they don't just retcon what happened before. The period of time where MJ, Ned, and Peter are apart without memories of one another, that takes a toll. MJ and Ned are different but similar people to the ones Peter knew, and Peter really does just have to get to know them now. A new version of them. He has all these memories that they apparently don't. And even with all this extra baggage, it still feels tense. You kind of still hope there's an easy workaround, but there isn't. That restraint allows each interaction to feel more heavy and weighted emotionally. The film avoids just giving us what we want, which is Peter Parker being happy, to give us what we really need, Peter Parker being miserable. As a result, all the pain feels all the more real. It's more of a challenge, there's more conflict. That emotional divide helps play into the difficulties Peter faces after abandoning his human identity for so long. It's stuff like that that makes the flaws like how does Peter afford his apartment feel trivial, because it's not really about that. It's about Peter Parker's emotional journey, and it does that so well that other issues with plotting and world building don't matter all that much. A lot of people say Brand New Day is a new start, but it really allows the consequences of Watts' trilogy to be felt. The big thing people complain about with Homecoming was that Peter existed in a world without consequences, or without significant consequences. With each subsequent film, Homecoming becomes all the more quaint and innocent by comparison, a good opening chapter to a larger story of difficulty. Because that is the only film where the consequences don't carry into the next film as much. Peter was happy, things were simple. Look how fast things have unraveled since then. This contrast allows each component to feel more valuable and distinct as a result. Again, a case of further sequels making older films seem more significant by comparison, and by relation. That being said, Peter and Ned's handshake at the end kind of indicates that there might be some way to subvert the memory erasing thing, or maybe it's Peter and Ned being reintroduced for the first time, and muscle memory carries through a familiar handshake that he can't associate with Peter, but associates with someone in his past. Perhaps the memory spell didn't erase the memory of a handshake with someone, and he followed through accordingly. Or Ned just figured out who Peter is. Or, as some people have pointed out, maybe Jean Grey is doing something kind. I don't know. Could be something. The most important thing here is that Peter is, once again, a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. New York feels real, material, in ways it didn't in the previous couple of films. My big complaint with Far From Home, we're away from the friendly neighborhood. But here, we're in there. We are in that neighborhood, and it feels real, and they are threats Peter has faced in that neighborhood. On paper, the plot's actually really simple. Peter is just investigating a new villain who is out for her own revenge against someone else. Along the way, he finds his loved ones threatened and questions his loyalties to other organizations and people. Super basic plot on paper. What elevates it is the character journey. Damage control is the main remnant left behind from his Tony Stark days. Tony Stark started damage control in the first Spider-Man movie, but now it's become the instigators of the plot. Again, we have a villain created due to Tony's influence, but it's not directly through Tony, it's through damage control, something Tony started. But damage control has gone from putting Adrian Toomes out of a job, to arresting Peter Parker in No Way Home, to becoming an institutional force Peter first tries to help maintain before fighting in the end, illustrating that you can't trust the government at all. Funny how that works out, isn't it? Peter has become the status quo and then rejects said status quo, something Captain America did in his own Winter Soldier movie, I think. But because the main threat, there's no reason to hide it anymore. Last warning, 3, 2, 1, it's Jean Grey. Finally, a cinematic story centered on Jean that has nothing to do with the Phoenix. Very happy about that. But we'll get to that in a bit. Some people are more divided on Jean Grey, considering that, she's the bad guy and takes spots away from established Spider-Man villains, but we'll get to that. Scorpion and several other villains like Tombstone, Boomerang, Tarantula, they appear, but they're very minor. Almost barely in the film. Scorpion is the biggest of them, and even he kind of disappears a half hour into the film, essentially. He has a couple scenes, and that's it. This, to me, feels very comic booky. Scorpion appeared in the first movie, kind of, and now he's here, back for revenge, and we're left with the impression he's gonna come back later on anyway. I feel like if we have these reoccurring antagonists who just show up, that's good, because technically Scorpion is just that. A reoccurring bad guy Peter has to fight. With how relevant the greater MCU is here, I do wish more Spider-Man related characters existed in the narrative for Peter to fight or bounce off of. Maybe he has to go get answers from Tombstone or whatever. But I feel all of this illustrates the little potato problems Peter faces, which reminds me again of how he is that friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. In the comics, when Carnage first appears, Peter tries going to the Fantastic Four and Avengers for help, but didn't want to do anything. Carnage was too small a threat for the FF to deal with when they're handling Galactus, That's ironic in hindsight, considering how many crossovers featured Carnage as a core player, from Axis to Absolute Carnage to the new Avengers storyline, where Sentry rips him apart, but I digress. But yeah, the film is a mystery story with Peter Parker investigating a crime. And the whole film makes me think of The Batman, the Matt Reeves one, where it's more superhero mystery than a story about Peter Parker. Bruce Wayne is less of a character than the Batman is in The Batman, and likewise Peter Parker, well, he's less prominent, but he's not less of a character. Peter Parker is overridden by guilt and hides his human needs to do the job. He's married to his job. And that's important. He's putting himself in self-exile, and his story runs parallel to Jean Grey and the Punisher. Jean's family is robbed from her, her sister's kidnapped and then killed. The film really emphasizes that the one thing keeping Peter from becoming like Jean or collapsing into himself like the Punisher is his memory of Aunt May. Peter exists as an emotional tether to both of them, as Aunt May exists as an emotional tether to him. In regards to the Punisher and Jean, both have lost their entire family, but no one is there to support them. Jean is isolated due to being a mutant, and due to her fear of connecting with people who are going to hurt her. Her adoptive family rejects her, her sister's kidnapped, the government's out to get her. Meanwhile, the Punisher's entire family was decimated in a hit. He's been driven to the thing he is now. And maybe people are going to complain. We don't see Tombstone or Scorpion wreck shop for 90 minutes. But look, that's because neither are really anchored to the core of Peter's story, the core of Brand New Day. But the Punisher and Jean Grey are instrumental to that emotional core. How do you reckon with the various components of yourself? How do you accept the parts you are reluctant to admit are yours? Very Persona 4-esque, I think. It's isolation and the impact that has on you psychologically as you devote yourself to the work. By contrast, Yelena is someone who just exists comfortably on her own, as her own person, because she's undergone this arc before. Thunderbolts was entirely about her feeling kind of lost in the shuffle of her own job. She's completed the arc Peter is trying to figure out. In this sense, the Thunderbolts and Spider-Man Brand New Day kind of run in tandem as well. Yelena is basically the final positive outcome of negotiating all the elements of your life into one place, while the Hulk is a little more complicated. We'll get to him in a bit. The three core emotional scenes of Brand New Day are when Peter and MJ kiss, when Jean, is in MJ's mind and makes her kiss. Very Obsession-esque. Very funny that two movies both involve the main character getting their love of their lives, fulfilling their dreams, only to see it turn into horror. And it also proves, by the way, that if Peter can tell MJ what's going on and be honest and reject the idea of the illusionary perfect version of MJ that he wants but can't have, that just shows Bear's more of a monster for sleeping with, I'm getting sidetracked, we're talking about a different movie now. Anyway, Jean tricks Peter into momentarily thinking he has everything he's dreamed about, that MJ remembers him, only to take it away in a cruel fashion and then send MJ flying off the top of a building. So there you go. It's a demonstration of her callousness that's later echoed in the finale, where Peter shares with Jean his memory of Aunt May, affirming that he is loved despite being different and showing that feeling to Jean. The other emotional scene, by the way, it's when MJ discovers that letter Peter wrote for her back in No Way Home, and being upfront that she doesn't remember him, and thus doesn't share the same emotional feelings for him that he has for her. And once again, Peter respects that, but is deeply hurt by that. It's a very real scene that allows us to feel the suppressed emotions through physical acting, where all parties are in a tough situation. No one's the bad guy here. It's just a sad situation, and its characters realistically trying to respond to that without hurting the other person. And it's deeply powerful stuff. Very well written character beats, elevated again by the real life relationship between Tom Holland and Zendaya. I know for myself, I was thinking they might introduce some new love interest for Peter, like Black Cat or what have you, but I think him not being able to move past MJ really makes it more powerful. You feel the weight of his sacrifice more. It's not like a Bond girl where he replaces her with someone else very quickly. He is emotionally compromised by this, and that pain hurts him. Denying the aspects of himself because he's married to his job causes Peter pain. This is another reason why I'm not really bothered by the lack of villains that really play a major role in the story. Peter's greatest enemy is himself. But what makes all these scenes more powerful is the lead up and follow up. MJ is dating someone. Who? Could be Paul, could be Harry Osborn, we don't really know. We know she's shut him out to some degree. With Jean, we see her entering into Peter's mind twice. The first time she steals information to use against him, and the second time Peter uses his experience not really against Jean, but to redirect her. And it's quite good, because we both see how Jean interprets Peter's actions at different stages of the narrative. once as a tool because she sees all people around her as tools, but then later she opens up more emotionally and maybe develops a sense of empathy towards those around her. Meanwhile, the Punisher, who is this isolated vigilante who lost his entire family to violence, reluctantly becomes Peter's peer and kind of watches over MJ. The Punisher is cold towards others, but there is still this sense that maybe he does want to emotionally connect with people. Maybe he does want to trust people. And that dynamic is subdued, but very effective. Even though the Punisher and Peter have drastically different philosophies, with Peter being more non-violent, wants to help save his villains. Remember the previous films, with the exception of Mysterio, Peter saved all of his antagonists. The Punisher believes in one final outcome. That divided philosophy is interesting, but it's also good to have someone on Peter's level. We almost had it with Doctor Strange at the end of No Way Home, but every other MCU cameo was a more mature figure from whom Peter was expected to learn something. Even though the lesson that he learned in each film was essentially to not do what they were doing, the mistakes of the past guiding Peter's future actions. But here, Punisher and Peter are equals, with Punisher actually having grown as a character due to association with Peter. The Punisher's philosophies are proven in many ways to be wrong by Peter, and the Punisher seems almost happy about it. Peter saving Jean and taking a bullet for her, that saves the city, that helps Jean move on, that recreates an iconic scene from Civil War. Yes, that one page, sure, but we don't see the Punisher go in a Joker-esque crash out or profound existential dread or guilt. We see the Punisher immediately do the right thing and save a life. A guy whose entire modus operandi is killing ends the film by saving a life. And even has a charming little gag at the end to help Peter sneak out of the hospital unseen with his identity intact. There's a charmingness to it. He almost seems happy to be wrong on a level we haven't seen the Punisher happy in a very long time. Meanwhile, despite all the domestic terrorism Jean commits, it's primarily aimed at institutional organizations run by Damage Control. The very organization that will just fucking snatch you off and drag you to a lab to be experimented on. It's hard to draw real-life comparisons between Damage Control and other organizations that do similar things. It makes you wonder what Damage Control is going to do to Kamala Khan or Wonder Man when they got them in their series, if they got their hands on them at all, or why they patrolled mosques looking for domestic terrorists. How did they get all the equipment from Shocker? How did they actually convince the Hand to follow them? Why are their faces in jars at Damage Control? A lot of elements are implied that makes Damage Control out to be this much more vastly dangerous organization that I think as we keep moving in the MCU will probably merge with stuff like the Sentinel program or the Friends of Humanity. I can reasonably see the X-Men dealing with Damage Control more overtly as we go on. I have no doubt that in the future, Damage Control will be more dangerous than Hydra, especially given what Peter gives them in this movie, but I digress. But instrumentally, those three emotional beats I mentioned, the MJ kiss, the MJ letter scene, and the final scene with Aunt May, they change the direction of the plot more than any fight scenes because it changes the direction in which Peter's arc travels. There are fight scenes, sure, but the conflict is mostly settled outside of those fights because it's not a fighting story. It's a character acceptance story. Again, it's Persona 4. When you realize it's Persona 4, and it's all about Peter accepting the truth of his shadow, that it is him, the movie gets a lot better, I think, in your interpretation of it anyway. People complain that the resolution with Jean is too similar to that of the Thunderbolts. Yeah, they are very similar. They're both stories about people who are lost in their jobs, confronting those whose lives are broken due to the forces of outside government organizations, be it the CIA, Ox, or Damage Control. They're experimented on, and it's about empathizing with these gods that we are able to avoid conflict. It's not about punching the threat out, it's about connecting emotionally with them. But really, the conflict between Jean and Peter, it's not that different than previous Spider-Man resolutions. Look at Vulture and Peter. Both Vulture and Jean Grey are figures who have been spurned by society. Ironically, the same organization, Damage Control. Fuck those guys. And they're both trying to do something for themselves. Vulture's more selfish, he's trying to make a job, profit, whatever. For Jean, though, it's getting answers. It's more selfless, before coming to terms with revenge. The conflicts are remarkably similar, as are the resolutions. Peter saves the antagonist from something outside their control, be it broken wings or a sniper round. though I find it strange how the Vulture gets glazed as being kind of a good guy, despite killing someone on screen, where Jean Grey doesn't really do that. You know? It's like one of those things where it's like they both kill people, they both take lives, they both do harm, but the reaction to Jean Grey has been more venomous and antagonistic than that of the Vulture. Maybe because Jean Grey is supposed to be a good guy, but I mean, every version of Jean Grey so far has committed at least a bunch of murders already, so I don't know what to tell you there, buddy. But there are fights, of course. There's Peter fighting the Scorpion, there's Peter fighting the Hulk, and there's Peter fighting the Hand Ninjas, who are possessed by Jean Grey. But of course, the Savage Hulk is the outlier, since that is kind of a random monkey wrench thrown into a scene. I think the Scorpion and the Hand fights are more focused on exploring Peter's evolving nature, where at first Peter loses control and almost kills a cop fighting Scorpion, and in the other, Peter comes to accept himself. Again, his Persona 4 moment. It runs parallel to his struggle to deny his human connections in favor of him being Spider-Man. Peter's suppression of his mutation is much like his suppression of his humanity, so it feels cathartic to, in the Hand fight, combine both problems. Peter resolves the division between Spider and Man at the same time as he accepts his difference between who he was and the version of him he's becoming. A Spider molting into adulthood. The two aspects of his personality unified. At least two different tracks of his personality aspects. His life as a man or his life as a Spider. But again, Savage Hulk is very different. So what thematic value does the Hulk serve? Why is the Hulk here? Well, for one, it illustrates how explosive power can have a devastating effect when suppressed for too long. Something we see Peter fear in himself, and something Jean unleashes in the third act. But for another, it's a chance for Spider-Man to fight someone stronger than him. Peter Parker is someone who, despite being in over his head, always finds a solution using cleverness and skill, as opposed to necessarily strength, though he has plenty of that to begin with. It's only thanks to his immense strength he doesn't die in 2 hits from the Hulk. Peter and the Hulk have fought multiple times in the comics, and the first that comes to mind is Amazing Spider-Man 14, the same issue that also debuted the Green Goblin. Peter Parker finds the Hulk hiding in a cave, they get into a conflict, Hulk runs away. It's very much like this. Hulk randomly shows up and causes things to go haywire, allowing the Green Goblin to get away and plan another day. But with this fight in the movie, with Brand New Day's fight with Hulk, I'm reminded of a different storyline altogether. Nothing Can Stop the Juggernaut, where Peter is forced to face off against the Juggernaut, an unstoppable villain of insurmountable power and momentum. Despite being so strong, Spider-Man keeps fighting, using skill and cleverness to ultimately win by trapping the Juggernaut in concrete. If he can't build momentum, he can't be unstoppable, can he? In this film, Spider-Man wins through a combination of dragging Hulk down, with the collective weight of a building essentially, as well as maybe appealing to Hulk's nature. He says, oh, I'm Peter, this, that, and the other, but Hulk wouldn't know who Peter is. It's more Hulk seeing his target as human that matters, and Hulk's self-reflection allowing Bruce to take over once again. I do like the idea that Jean Grey's meddling has caused unexpected consequences, like the Hulk going nuts. It illustrates that Jean Grey's attacks on damage control, despite being focused on damage control, can have ramifications beyond all that. Which again runs parallel to Peter, whose actions also have unintended consequences. Do you think that chip isn't going to be used by Sentinel program guys, or? The way Peter beats Hulk is in many ways similar to how Peter beats Doctor Strange, using webbing, physics, and momentum to kind of trap Strange in his own trick. The only difference is Hulk is basically winning. Peter would have died if Hulk didn't stop at that point. I can imagine some fans being disappointed that Spider-Man has so few mainstays in his film as the focus, but every aspect of this story exists to service the core internal conflict, the driving conflict. That's what the best Spider-Man films do, focuses on Spider-Man's development as a person over stopping the bad guy of the week. Villains like Scorpion and Tombstone are sidelined, yeah, and they're iconic, yeah, but the story is satisfying because we see Spider-Man grow from pain, to experience the lasting trauma he experiences. Some of the best Spider-Man stories introduce unusual villains and focus on Peter Parker dealing with big existential questions. The start of JMS's run, for example, does that very same thing. We see Peter authentically suffer due to his choices, even when they're good in Brand New Day. He uses his emotional journey to help other characters on their journey, and so channels his pain into something productive. That is the most Spider-Man thing I can think of. But further, the existence of Hulk exists as a counter-argument to Peter's ultimate conclusion. Like Peter, Hulk is someone who is struggling with himself, who uses technology to suppress the mutation, the transformation into the Hulk persona. And Bruce has struggled for years to compromise both elements of his own persona. Much like how in the film's resolution, Peter combines the Spider and the Man. Bruce combined the Hulk and Bruce. But Jean's interference fractures Hulk's psyche, resulting in the Savage Hulk returning. Hulk is proof that you can't just always unite all the aspects of your persona into one. That fight is ultimately one of different philosophies, and depending on your viewpoint, you can argue that Jean either proved you can't find a balance between the monster and the man, between these opposing perspectives of the soul, or Peter proved you can at least control the worst of yourself. That even when you lose control, you are not untethered to your true nature. There's ambiguity here that's not totally addressed, because maybe you can't really definitively answer these questions we're asking. Maybe it's not so black and white. Maybe finding a balance is an ongoing struggle, one that won't be so easily resolved in one film, which bodes well for the rest of the trilogy. One element of parallel structure that a lot of fans aren't discussing is how Peter, in his pursuit to suppress his own mutations, creates the inhibitor chip, something based on what Hulk has done to suppress his transformations. And we have hints that it's something dangerous potentially. And we see in the film it being used by Damage Control to better manipulate Jean Grey. Hulk has used his efforts to suppress his other personality, but Peter's inhibitor chip is used to suppress mutation, to suppress powers, and now Damage Control has a weapon to even the playing field. No matter how powerful you are, if this chip can break your skin, it can be used to control you. And who knows if it'll get better, like say be a neck brace, something like that. This chip will be used to suppress mutations in the MCU moving forward. This tool won't just be used to help Spider-Man, it will be used to hurt the countless people in the world of Spider-Man. Much like how Tony's experiments resulted in harm being done to others, with unexpected ramifications, Peter Parker has created a weapon that will outlive him and cause immense harm to other characters. You can see right now why the X-Men might in some future film want to beat the shit out of the Avengers, especially someone like Magneto. All of this is like how Tony Stark created Damage Control and thus began a system that oppresses mutants. Then again, he did want to keep Wanda caged up, so maybe that works out. And again, it's interesting too how Peter exercises more empathy towards Jean Grey and the Avengers did for Wanda. Civil War put into perspective how much of the collateral damage throughout the MCU had lasting impacts. So this instance will make Spider-Man's decisions in a brand new day have larger consequences. Spider-Man, even when he does the right thing, always has consequences. That's good. But also, and this is important, Aunt May has a pivotal role in the finale, despite being dead. Back in Far From Home, I mentioned how Aunt May should have played a more pivotal role in the finale instead of Happy Hogan. What if Aunt May talked to Peter after all the stuff with Iron Man and Mysterio, right? Well, here we see Aunt May making the speech I wanted to see in Far From Home. Aunt May talking to Peter on a personal level, presumably between Homecoming and Far From Home, but who knows when it happened, to give a speech about how he's loved and valuable despite sometimes being wanted for different reasons. In many ways, I can't help but think of Iron Man with this, because Iron Man used Peter as a tool, as an asset to further his fights. Maybe Aunt May's referring to the way Iron Man maybe used Peter in some way, or the way Nick Fury was using Peter in some way. Some people have said that it feels too tailor-suited to this particular conflict to be natural and organic, but I can see that slotting into Homecoming's events or Far From Home's events quite nicely, because both films were about people using Peter Parker for selfish intents. This one scene is more in retrospect to develop Aunt May than all of her scenes in the prior 4 movies she appeared in. Yes, that counts Civil War. It does more to humanize Aunt May, which I guess was also true of Uncle Ben, right? In the comics, he gets more development dead in flashbacks than he did alive in Amazing Fantasy 15, because he was only in that for like a few pages, but I digress. He got more development in flashbacks, which helped anchor Uncle Ben to be this figure that we love and respect years later. All this to say, I think the Watts films are a great foundation to start with, but the obvious flaws in that trilogy are being filled by later writers who identify a weakness and fill in the blanks whenever something happens that requires an anchor to that base. It's reductive to say if this film saved the MCU Spider-Man because it could not really exist without the previous examples of the MCU Spider-Man. In fact, I'd argue this film does what every great sequel should. It elevates what came before while also doing its own thing. As a story, all separate pieces feed into the other, where character beats and character dynamics run parallel to the mystery plot. One of the breakthroughs Peter has on the mystery surrounding damage control comes because he's vulnerable with MJ, admitting he kissed her when she was possessed, and MJ's response that, well, she doesn't remember it anyway, leads Peter to figure out to have a big moment of revelation. The guy lied to him. Because, you get the idea if you've seen the movie I'm talking about. All this demonstrates an incredible economy of storytelling, combining character interactions with the external conflict. I think the film exists as a great companion piece to Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2. Not in terms of quality, Spider-Man 2 is better by a lot, but in terms of parallel storytelling. Both are about Spider-Man struggling to negotiate the two halves of his life. But while Spider-Man 2 is about Peter Parker giving up being Spider-Man, Brand New Day is about Spider-Man giving up being Peter Parker, and how neither option is good. You can't do it all. But whereas Spider-Man 2 is more about feeling the consequences of giving up Spider-Man, seeing the harm that the world experiences, Brand New Day focuses on the harm being done to the self. And both movies end with Peter, rather than necessarily beating up the villain, reasoning with them, helping them grow and become better people. Like, yeah, it's a bit of a fight, but it's superficial compared to the talk at the end. But ultimately, the next step is obviously Secret Wars, and Peter has to deal with potentially losing something more. Maybe someone. Next film, like say Jean the Wolf, now that he's opened himself up and is more emotionally vulnerable. Jean the Wolf will probably die next Spider-Man film. And in Secret Wars, he's probably going to get the black suit or something on Battleworld. I do really want to see how Venom would fit into this world, especially given how much aura Savage Hulk has in this brief scene. Imagine a scene with Venom with that much horrifying aura to it. Would be pretty cool, not gonna lie. Given what Cretton can do with Hulk, Venom can absolutely work and be savage. Can't wait for that. Especially if we see Venom deal with other characters. Can you imagine Venom encountering Punisher? It would be great. Would love that. Or, maybe Human Torch. That'd be kind of cool. I don't know. I just want to see Human Torch in a Spider-Man movie. Okay, is that so hard? I don't know. Or Wolverine and Venom. I mean, there's options. There's options. But before that, we hand Spider-Man off to the Russos in Secret Wars to see how they pick up what Cretton is putting down. Will they take the baton and run with it, or will there be more growing pains? Will they write Spider-Man differently now that he's in a different spot in his life? Will Spider-Man regress back to the pre-Far From Home days, or will the Russos understand where Spider-Man is and how to take him forward to the next step? That's always the risk with multiple creative parties writing for a singular character in the same continuity. But here's the question. Did Tom Holland's run ruin Spider-Man? Well, a lot of people who say that Tom Holland is the worst Spider-Man or the MCU ruined Spider-Man, they'll say that Tom Holland's Spider-Man does not compare to Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, which I guess is like comparing different runs again, How do you compare the Steve Ditko, Stan Lee run to the JMS run? They're very different. So how is MCU Peter different than Raimi Peter? How is the Raimi run different than the Watts run, or the Cretton run, or the Russo run? Raimi told a very contained trilogy of films. It's a throwback to the classic 60s era. What a lot of people say that do compare one to the other is that they take the best of the Raimi trilogy and compare it to the worst of the MCU. And look, if you take the best scene of Peter swinging and compare it to some bad compositing from No Way Home or whatever, yeah, it's easy to make one look bad and the other one look good. But that's not a fair comparison. It's not a good way of doing media criticism. It's easy to throw the best at the worst and come to a conclusion, but it's harder to look at what each one does great. For every great swinging scene in the Raimi films, there's some clever stuff in the MCU, like Peter hanging upside down from the city, telling us that Peter's life is completely inverted, that his human side is so far removed from that material-friendly neighborhood that he occupies, that he helps. Raimi's films are extremely centered on Peter as a monolith, as one figure, with his personal issues driving everything. The MCU Peter also has that, but it's also about how Peter fits into the greater world collectively. You can make the argument that most of the supporting cast that Peter deals with in the MCU trilogy are more one note than the Raimi trilogy, and that's fair. You're not wrong. Ned is one note, so's MJ, but they're likable. Whereas I think Raimi often made more complicated characters, but his MJ is very not likable. And it's here that you really gotta ask if they succeeded with what they tried to do, to fit Peter into this greater world, having him go from a trainee who someone inspires change in, to someone who inspires change in others, even the most hardened of monsters. Every film is unique. Every film brings a different angle of Peter Parker forward. It's hard to compare the same character to himself so often as written by different people, but when you do so, you realize that the films take Peter in different ways, take different aspects of who he is, and tries to do something with him. To date, this is the most extensive Spider-Man narrative we've had, with the most appearances, the most to talk about. And it's complicated. It's not always straightforward. It's not always as focused as Raimi's trilogy is, but it's not always about that. Sometimes it's not about taking the best writing with the worst, it's about looking to see what they tried to accomplish. And ultimately speaking, I think they're doing a pretty good job. Yeah, Far From Home isn't the best Spider-Man solo film, but hey, 3 out of 4, it ain't that bad.